The auction block in Lordsburg, New Mexico, stood beneath a merciless July sun in 1878, and Hannah Jensen felt the wood burning through the thin soles of her worn boots as she climbed the steps with her head held high despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Her father sat slumped in the shade across the dusty street, his face buried in his hands, unable to watch what his gambling debts had brought them to. $3,000 owed to Vincent Calhoun, the most ruthless man in the territory, and not a penny to their name except the small ranch that was already mortgaged to the bank. When Calhoun had come calling 2 days ago with his proposition, her father had wept like a child, but Hannah had made the choice herself. Better this than watching her father swing from a rope or take a bullet in some dark alley. The auctioneer, a thin man with a weasel face and tobacco-stained teeth, gripped her arm too tightly as he positioned her at the front of the platform. A crowd had gathered in the town square, men mostly, their eyes crawling over her like insects. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but she forced herself to stand straight. 22 years old, and her life was being sold to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock. "Gentlemen, we have here Miss Hannah Jensen," the auctioneer called out in a voice that carried across the square. "Young, healthy, can cook and clean and run a household. Her father's debts total $3,000. Bidding starts at that amount." Hannah closed her eyes, praying for it to be over quickly. She heard a few low voices murmuring in the crowd, but no one spoke up immediately. The silence stretched, painful and humiliating. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer pressed. "A fine young woman like this, surely someone sees the value here. 3,000, a voice finally called out. Hannah opened her eyes to see Robert Sutton, a widower in his 50s who owned the general store. He had always looked at her strangely when she came in to buy supplies. Her stomach turned. 3,000 from Mr. Sutton, the auctioneer acknowledged. "Do I hear 3,200? Another silence. Hannah felt hope dying in her chest. She would go to Robert Sutton, would spend her days in his house, subject to whatever he demanded of her. The future stretched before her, bleak and terrible. Then a voice like distant thunder rolled across the square. 6,000. Every head turned. Hannah's eyes went wide as she searched the crowd for the speaker. The sea of men parted, and through the gap walked a figure that seemed carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun as he approached the platform. His hair was dark brown, sun-streaked, and hanging past his shoulders in thick waves that he'd tied back with a leather cord. A full beard covered his strong jaw, but couldn't hide the hard lines of his face or the intensity of his gray eyes. He wore buckskin pants and a shirt that strained across a chest built from years of hard living in the wilderness. His arms were thick with muscle, his hands large and calloused. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and self-reliance. A mountain man. Hannah had heard stories of such men, trappers and hunters who lived in the high country, coming to town only a few times a year for supplies. This one moved with a predator's grace despite his size, completely at ease with every eye on him. 6,000. The auctioneer repeated, his voice climbing with excitement. "Mr. Marlowe, did you say $6,000? "I did." The mountain man's voice was deep and steady. He stopped at the base of the platform, looking up at Hannah with an expression she couldn't read. 6,000 in gold. Robert Sutton sputtered. "Now see here, that's twice what's needed." "Then bid higher if you want her," the mountain man said without looking at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Hannah's face. The auctioneer was practically dancing now. 6,000 from Mr. Fletcher Marlowe. "Do I hear 6,200? Sutton's face had gone red. "This is ridiculous. The debt is 3,000. "Then pay 6,001, Fletcher Marlowe said calmly, "or step aside." The silence that followed was absolute. No one in Lordsburg would outbid Fletcher Marlowe, Hannah realized, not because they couldn't, but because they were afraid. This was a man who lived by his own rules, who answered to no authority but his own conscience. Even the auctioneer seemed nervous now. "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice." He paused, giving Sutton one last chance, but the shopkeeper just shook his head and backed away. "Sold. Miss Hannah Jensen to Mr. Fletcher Marlowe for $6,000. Hannah's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the railing in front of her, her mind reeling. $6,000, double what was needed. Why would anyone do that? Fletcher Marlowe climbed the steps to the platform with measured movements. Up close, he was even more imposing, towering over her by nearly a foot. The muscles in his arms flexed as he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked heavily with gold coins. He counted them out onto a small table the auctioneer had produced, his movements efficient and precise. $3,000 for Vincent Calhoun, Fletcher said as he stacked the coins. $3,000 for Hannah Jensen's father, to clear any other debts and give him a fresh start. He turned to look at the auctioneer. "You make sure Calhoun gets his money and not a penny more. The rest goes to Henry Jensen directly. Understand?" The auctioneer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, Mr. Marlowe. I'll see to it personally." Fletcher turned to Hannah then, and she found herself looking up into eyes the color of storm clouds. Up close, she could see the weathered lines at the corners of those eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the strength in every line of his face. He couldn't be more than 30, she thought, perhaps 28 or 29. "Can you ride?" he asked her. Hannah blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yes, I can ride." "Good." He gestured toward the steps. "My horse is at the livery. We're leaving. Leaving now." The world was moving too fast. Everything was happening too fast. Unless you want to stay for the social pleasantries. There might have been the ghost of humor in his voice, but his expression remained serious. "Your choice." Her choice. The words struck her strangely. She descended the platform steps on shaking legs, aware of the crowd watching, of her father finally looking up with tears streaming down his weathered face. Fletcher Marlowe walked beside her, a solid presence that somehow made the gawking crowd seem less threatening. Her father rushed forward, nearly stumbling. "Hannah, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." "Hush, Papa." She took his hand, squeezing tight. "You heard Mr. Marlowe. You'll have money to start fresh. Take it and leave this town. Go to Santa Fe like you always talked about. Find good work. Live well. But I'll be all right." She didn't know if that was true, but she said it anyway. She kissed his cheek, breathing in the familiar smell of tobacco and saddle soap one last time. "Be well, Papa, be happy." Fletcher cleared his throat gently. "We need to go before it gets later." "It's a long ride to my cabin." Hannah nodded, pulling away from her father's desperate grip. She had nothing to take with her, no possessions beyond the simple dress she wore and the boots on her feet. Everything she owned in the world had been sold weeks ago to try to pay down her father's debts. The livery stable was blessedly cool after the brutal sun of the square. Fletcher's horse stood in one of the stalls, a massive roan stallion that matched its owner in size and temperament. The animal tossed its head as they approached, but calmed immediately when Fletcher placed a hand on its neck. "This is Ranger," Fletcher said, stroking the horse's muzzle. "He's steady, but he doesn't like surprises. Move slow around him until he knows you." Hannah approached carefully, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. Ranger's dark eyes studied her with what seemed like intelligence. Then he huffed softly and allowed her to touch his neck. His coat was warm beneath her palm, his muscles solid and powerful. Fletcher pulled a second horse from another stall, a gentler-looking mare with a sweet face. "This is Daisy." She's yours to ride. Mine. Hannah stared at him. You just bought me and you're giving me a horse. Something flickered in Fletcher's eyes, an emotion too quick to name. I didn't buy you, Hannah. I paid your father's debts. There's a difference. The auctioneer said. I don't care what the auctioneer said. Fletcher's voice was firm but not harsh. I paid $6,000, $3,000 to free your father from Vincent Calhoun, who would have killed him within the month, $3,000 to give him a chance at a real life. The auction was just a means to an end. Hannah's mind struggled to process this. Then why did you bid at all? Why not just pay my father's debts directly? Fletcher began saddling Ranger with practiced efficiency. Because Calhoun would have found another excuse to go after your father. He's that kind of man. This way, everything is legal and documented. The debt is paid in full with witnesses. Calhoun has no claim. He paused, his hands stilling on the saddle. And because I saw you up on that platform, and I saw the kind of men who were looking at you, and I couldn't let you go to one of them. The honesty in his words took her breath away. So what happens now? What do you want from me? Fletcher turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart race. I want you to come to my cabin in the mountains. I want you to see how I live, what my life is like. And then, when you've seen it all, when you know what you'd be choosing, I want you to decide if you'll stay. Stay as what? As my wife, if you'll have me. The words were simple, direct, with no flowery speech or false romance. I live alone up there, Hannah. Have for 5 years now since I left my family's ranch in Colorado. It's a hard life, but it's honest. I hunt, I trap, I trade furs. I have enough money saved to live comfortably, to build a real home if I had reason to. But I won't lie to you, it's isolated and it's demanding. Winter is brutal, summer is short. The nearest town is a 2-day ride. Hannah's heart was pounding. And if I say no, if I decide I don't want that life, then I'll bring you back to civilization. Santa Fe, maybe, or Denver. I'll give you enough money to start over, to build whatever life you want. You'll be free, with no obligations to anyone. His expression softened slightly. You've been sold like property, Hannah. I'm giving you the choice to take your life back. Tears blurred her vision. In all her 22 years, no one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever offered her true choice. Her father had loved her, but he'd also gambled away everything they had and put her on an auction block. The men of Lordsburg had watched her humiliation like entertainment, but this stranger, this mountain man with storm-cloud eyes and a body built for survival, was offering her freedom. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for someone you don't even know? Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. My mother was in a situation like yours once, before she met my father. Different circumstances, but the same powerlessness. My father helped her when no one else would. He always said that if you have the means to help someone and you don't, you're complicit in their suffering. He looked at her again. I have the means. I couldn't walk away. Hannah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come see the cabin. Give it a week. If after a week you want to leave, I'll respect that. He extended his hand to her. Deal. She looked at his hand, so much larger than hers, calloused and strong. Then she looked at his face, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. All she saw was earnest honesty and a quiet strength that called to something deep inside her. She placed her hand in his. Deal. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful despite their strength. Then he released her and turned to finish preparing the horses. Within minutes, they were mounted and heading out of Lordsburg, leaving behind the only life Hannah had ever known. The ride into the mountains took 3 days. Fletcher set a steady pace, stopping frequently to rest the horses and make sure Hannah was managing. She'd said she could ride, and it was true, but she wasn't accustomed to full days in the saddle. By the time they made camp the first night, her legs were trembling and her back ached. Fletcher chose a spot beside a small stream where cottonwood trees provided shade and the water ran clear and cold. He helped Hannah down from Daisy with gentle hands, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled. "Sit," he said, guiding her to a smooth rock near the water. "Rest while I set up camp." Hannah wanted to protest, to offer to help, but her body had other ideas. She sank onto the rock gratefully, watching as Fletcher moved through the tasks of making camp with the efficiency of long practice. He unsaddled the horses and brushed them down, talking to them in a low voice as he worked. Then he gathered firewood, built a fire ring with stones, and had a small blaze going within minutes from his saddlebags. He produced coffee, beans, salt pork, and a small cast iron pan. He set the coffee on to boil and started preparing their meal, his large hands surprisingly deft at the work. "You're staring," he said without looking up from the beans he was stirring. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry, you're very self-sufficient." "Have to be, living alone in the mountains." He glanced up at her, and there might have been the hint of a smile beneath his beard. "You'll learn if you stay. Can't survive up there without knowing how to take care of yourself. What if I'm terrible at it?" Now he did smile, just a slight curve of his lips. "Then I'll teach you until you're not terrible anymore. Everyone starts somewhere." The coffee boiled, rich and strong, and Fletcher poured her a cup in a battered tin mug. Hannah wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth as the desert air began to cool with the setting sun. She sipped carefully, watching Fletcher finish preparing their supper. When the food was ready, he served her a generous portion on a tin plate and settled across the fire from her with his own meal. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle burbling of the stream. "Tell me about your cabin," Hannah said eventually. "What's it like?" Fletcher chewed thoughtfully before answering. "It's sturdy. Built it myself from pine logs. One large room with a loft for sleeping, a stone fireplace, good windows with real glass. I've got a root cellar for storage, a smokehouse for meat, a small barn for the horses. There's a creek nearby, always running, even in late summer. Good hunting in the hills, deer and elk, turkey sometimes, fish in the creek. It sounds peaceful." "It is." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "But it's also lonely. That's why I come down to Lordsburg a few times a year, to remember what it's like to be around people. Usually I just get my supplies and leave, but this time—" He trailed off, looking at her across the flames. "This time you spent $6,000 on a woman from an auction," Hannah finished softly. "This time I did what I had to do." His eyes held hers. "I don't regret it. You might when you know me better. I'm not." She struggled for words. "I'm not special. I'm just an ordinary woman who wasn't smart enough to stop her father from gambling. That wasn't your fault. I should have done something, taken control of the money, or—" "Hannah," Fletcher's voice was gentle but firm, "you can't control another person's demons. Gambling is a sickness. Your father has to fight it himself, and maybe now, with a fresh start, he will. But his failures aren't yours to carry." The kindness in his words broke something open inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. All the fear and humiliation and grief of the past days came pouring out. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. She heard Fletcher move, felt the warmth of him as he sat down beside her on the rock. He didn't touch her, didn't try to shush her or tell her everything would be all right. He just sat there, a solid presence in the darkness, and let her cry until she had no tears left. When she finally lifted her head, he offered her a handkerchief. She took it gratefully, wiping her face and blowing her nose. "Sorry," she mumbled, "don't be. You're entitled to your grief." He stood, moving back to his side of the fire. "Get some rest. We have another long day tomorrow." He'd set up bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, she realized. Hers had extra blankets, and he'd positioned it on the softest-looking patch of ground. Everything about his actions spoke of respect and consideration. Hannah settled into her bedroll, her body aching but her mind strangely quiet. Across the fire, Fletcher sat with his back against a tree, his rifle across his lap, keeping watch. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was his silhouette against the stars, solid and unwavering. The second day of riding brought them into higher country, where pine trees replaced the desert scrub and the air grew noticeably cooler. Hannah's muscles had loosened up from the day before, and she found herself enjoying the ride more, appreciating the stark beauty of the landscape. Fletcher pointed out landmarks as they rode, telling her about the territory. He spoke of the Apache who sometimes moved through these mountains, of the Mexican traders who used the old trails, of the miners who'd come looking for silver and gold. His knowledge of the land was deep and intimate, built from years of living in harmony with it. They stopped for lunch beside a small waterfall, where Fletcher caught 2 trout with his bare hands, moving through the shallow pool with patience and precision. He cleaned the fish and cooked them over a small fire, the flesh flaky and delicious. "How did you learn to do that?" Hannah asked, licking her fingers. "My grandfather was part Shoshone. He taught me to hunt and fish, to read the land, to survive with nothing but my wits and my hands." Fletcher stared into the fire. "He said the mountains would teach me everything else I needed to know if I listened. Did they? Eventually." His lips quirked. "I was stubborn at first, thought I knew better than the land, nearly got myself killed a few times before I learned humility." Hannah found herself smiling. "I can't imagine you being stubborn." "Can't you?" He looked at her with amusement in his eyes. "I paid double price for a woman at an auction. If that's not stubborn, I don't know what is." She laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last laughed? Not in the terrible weeks leading up to the auction, certainly. Maybe not in months before that, as her father's debts had mounted and the walls had closed in. Fletcher's expression softened at the sound. "That's better. You should laugh more." "Maybe I will if I have reason to." "I'll try to give you reasons." The simple promise warmed her more than the fire. They finished their meal and mounted up again, climbing higher into the mountains. The terrain grew more rugged, the trail narrower, but Fletcher navigated it with easy confidence. That night they camped in a grove of aspen trees, their white bark glowing in the firelight. Hannah was exhausted but also exhilarated, her body adapting to the demands of the journey. She helped Fletcher with the camp this time, fumbling but earnest. He showed her how to properly hobble the horses, how to arrange stones for the most efficient fire, how to hang their food supplies from a tree branch to keep animals away. "You're a good teacher," she said as they settled down to eat. "You're a good student." He handed her a plate of beans and dried beef. "Quick learner." They talked late into the night, Fletcher telling her about his childhood in Colorado, about the ranch his family had built from nothing. He'd left, he explained, after his parents died within a year of each other. His older brother had inherited the ranch, and Fletcher had felt restless, confined by the idea of settling into a predictable life. "I wanted to test myself," he said, "to see if I could survive on my own terms. So I came down into New Mexico territory, up into these mountains, and I built a life from scratch." "You ever regret it?" "Sometimes. When winter is long and supplies run low, when I'm sick and there's no one to help, when I wake up and realize I haven't spoken to another person in weeks." He met her eyes. "But mostly no, I like the freedom. I like knowing that everything I have I built with my own hands." "What made you decide you wanted a wife?" The question hung between them. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the fire. "Loneliness," he said finally. "I can handle being alone, but that's different from wanting to be alone. And I'm 30 years old. If I'm going to build a real life, a family, it's time to start." He looked at her. "When I saw you on that platform, looking so brave even though you were terrified, I thought, there's a woman who knows how to survive, who knows how to be strong. That's the kind of partner I want." Hannah's heart beat faster. "You don't know me, though. I might not be that person. You stood on an auction block with your head high to save your father's life. You chose to ride into the mountains with a stranger rather than give up. You're learning skills you've never needed before because you're determined to adapt." Fletcher's voice was intense. "You're exactly that person, Hannah. You just don't see it yet." She didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever seen her the way he seemed to. No one had ever believed in her strength. She lay in her bedroll that night, staring up at the stars through the aspen leaves, thinking about Fletcher's words, about the life he was offering, about the choice that waited at the end of their journey. The third day brought them to Fletcher's land. The trail climbed to a high valley nestled between peaks, where a crystal creek ran through meadows of wildflowers. The cabin sat at the edge of the tree line, exactly as Fletcher had described it. Solid pine logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney rising from one end, windows reflecting the afternoon sun. The barn nearby was smaller but equally well built, and beyond it, Hannah could see a garden plot and what looked like the smokehouse Fletcher had mentioned. It was beautiful. Wild and remote, but beautiful. Fletcher helped her down from Daisy, and she stood looking at the cabin, trying to imagine living here. The silence was profound, broken only by the creek's murmur and the whisper of wind through the pines. No voices, no wagon wheels, no sounds of town life. Just nature and solitude. "Come on," Fletcher said. "I'll show you inside." The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a handmade table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies and books, a cooking area with a good iron stove. Furs covered the plank floor, thick and soft. A ladder led up to the loft where Fletcher slept. Everything was clean and well organized, showing a man who took pride in his home. "There's a separate room I started building last year," Fletcher said, opening a door she hadn't noticed. "I was going to make it a workshop, but it could be a bedroom. For you, while you decide. Privacy." The room was small but finished, with a window looking out toward the creek and a bed frame he'd obviously built by hand. No mattress yet, but she could see he'd already started thinking about how to make her comfortable. "It's perfect," Hannah said softly. Over the next 3 days, Hannah explored her new surroundings while Fletcher went about his usual work. He checked his trap lines, hunted for fresh meat, chopped wood for the winter stores. He offered to teach her as he worked, and she eagerly accepted. She learned to skin a rabbit, to tan leather, to identify edible plants in the forest. Fletcher was patient with her mistakes, encouraging with her successes. She learned that he had a quiet sense of humor, often catching her off guard with dry observations that made her laugh. She learned that he was intensely focused when working, his whole being concentrated on the task at hand. She learned that he was thoughtful, often leaving small gifts for her to find a handful of wild strawberries, a smooth river stone, a feather from a blue jay. She also learned about the demands of mountain life. The work was constant and physical. Water had to be hauled from the creek. The garden needed tending. Firewood needed cutting and stacking. Meat needed smoking. There were no servants here, no easy conveniences. Everything required effort and planning. But there was also freedom. No one telling her what to do or who to be. No social expectations or propriety to maintain. Just the rhythm of the land and the seasons, honest work and honest living. On the evening of her 4th day at the cabin, Hannah sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Fletcher emerged from the barn where he'd been tending the horses and came to sit beside her on the steps. "Well," he asked quietly, "what do you think?" Hannah took a breath, gathering her thoughts. "I think it's beautiful here. I think the work is hard but satisfying. I think the silence takes getting used to, but I'm starting to appreciate it." "And what do you think about staying?" She turned to look at him. In the golden light, his features seemed softer, the hard edges of his face gentled. His gray eyes watched her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have questions," she said. "Ask them." "If I stay, if I agree to marry you, what would that look like? I don't know you, Fletcher, not really. How do we build a life together when we're strangers?" Fletcher nodded slowly. "We take time. We learn each other. I won't rush you into anything you're not ready for." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If you agree to marry me, we'll do it legal and proper in Lordsburg. But sharing a bed, having children, all of that happens when you want it to happen, not before." "You'd really wait for the right woman?" "Yes." His voice was firm. "I want a partner, Hannah, a true partner. That means respect and patience and building trust. I won't force anything on you." Hannah's heart swelled. "What if I'm never ready? What if I can't be the wife you want?" "Then we'll figure it out together. Maybe we'll be partners and companions instead of romantic lovers. Maybe we'll find our own way of making this work." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. "All I know is that I feel something when I look at you, something I've never felt before, and I think if you give it time you might feel it too." She did feel something. Had felt it growing over these past days, watching him work, listening to him talk, seeing the care he took with everything from the horses to the garden to her. Respect, certainly. Gratitude, absolutely. But also a fluttering warmth in her chest when he smiled, a security in his presence that made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. Was it love? She didn't know, but it was the beginning of something. "I'll stay," she said softly. "I'll marry you, Fletcher Marlowe. And I'll do my best to be the partner you deserve." His fingers tightened on hers, and the smile that spread across his face transformed it entirely. "You just made me the happiest man in the territory." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Then he stood, pulling her up with him, and drew her into his arms for the first time. Being held by Fletcher was like being enfolded in safety itself. His arms were strong around her, his chest broad and solid against her cheek. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and sure, feel the warmth of him seeping through her clothes. One of his hands cradled the back of her head, his touch impossibly gentle for someone so powerful. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "Thank you for choosing this, for choosing me." Hannah wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him close. "Thank you for giving me a choice." They stood like that as the sun sank below the mountains, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Two people who'd been strangers a week ago, now bound together by an unlikely circumstance and a fragile, growing hope. The trip back to Lordsburg took 4 days as they traveled more slowly, enjoying the journey. Fletcher held her hand as they rode side by side on the wider parts of the trail. They talked constantly, sharing stories from their pasts, learning each other's histories and dreams. Hannah told him about her mother, who died when she was 12, leaving her to run the household while her father worked. She told him about the small joys of her childhood, the friends she'd had, the books she'd loved to read. She confessed her fears about being a good wife, about living up to his expectations. Fletcher listened to it all with patient attention, never dismissing her concerns. He told her about his own fears, about wondering if he was too set in his ways to share his life with someone, about worrying that he'd forget how to be gentle after so many years alone. "You haven't forgotten," Hannah assured him. "You're the gentlest man I've ever known." He'd looked at her with such warmth that she'd blushed and changed the subject. By the time they reached Lordsburg, Hannah felt like she'd known Fletcher for years instead of just over a week. The connection between them had deepened with every mile, every conversation, every shared meal around the campfire. They found a preacher and arranged for a wedding the next day, giving Hannah time to buy a proper dress. Fletcher gave her money without hesitation, insisting she get whatever she wanted. She chose a simple gown of blue calico, practical but pretty, with white lace at the collar and cuffs. The ceremony was small, with just the preacher, his wife as witness, and the two of them. Hannah wore wildflowers in her hair that Fletcher had picked that morning. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Fletcher kissed her for the first time, his lips gentle and questioning against hers. It was a sweet kiss, full of promise and restraint. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers. "All right?" he asked softly. "More than all right," she whispered back. They spent their wedding night in the boarding house in separate rooms. Fletcher had insisted, saying there was no need to rush. Hannah appreciated his consideration, but as she lay alone in the narrow bed, she found herself wishing he was there. Not for anything physical, but just for his presence, his steadiness, the comfort of knowing he was near. In the morning, they loaded up fresh supplies and began the journey back to the cabin. Their cabin now, Hannah thought with a thrill. Their home. The summer passed in a golden haze of hard work and growing intimacy. Hannah learned the rhythms of mountain life, her body growing stronger as she adapted to the physical demands. Fletcher taught her to shoot, spending patient hours showing her how to aim and fire his rifle until she could hit a target reliably. He taught her to fish, to track animals through the forest, to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the wildlife. She cooked their meals, learning to make bread in the Dutch oven and to season game with wild herbs. She tended the garden, watching with pride as the vegetables she'd planted flourished. She learned to preserve food for winter, drying meat and putting up vegetables in the root cellar. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other as husband and wife. It started with small touches. Fletcher's hand at the small of her back as they walked, Hannah reaching out to brush pine needles from his hair, sitting close together on the porch in the evenings, their shoulders touching. Then kisses, sweet and increasingly passionate as they explored the attraction building between them. Fletcher never pushed, always letting Hannah set the pace. But his desire was evident in the way his hands trembled when he cupped her face, in the rough edge to his breathing when they parted. 6 weeks after their wedding, on a warm August night, Hannah came down from the loft where she'd been sleeping and found Fletcher sitting by the fire, unable to rest. She crossed the room silently and knelt beside his chair. "Fletcher," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Hannah, can't sleep. I don't want to sleep alone anymore." Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "I want to be your wife in truth, if you'll have me." His expression transformed, hope and desire and tenderness all mixed together. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He stood, drawing her up with him, and kissed her with a depth of feeling that made her knees weak. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and she felt the last of her reservations melt away. This was right. He was right. Fletcher carried her up to the loft, laying her on the bed with exquisite gentleness. What followed was tender and awkward and beautiful, two people learning each other's bodies with care and patience. Fletcher was considerate of her inexperience, moving slowly, making sure she was comfortable and willing every step of the way. Afterward, Hannah lay wrapped in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she'd never felt so safe, so cherished. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. She felt him still, then his arms tightened around her. "Say that again." "I love you, Fletcher Marlowe, with everything I am." He turned, rolling to face her, his hand cupping her cheek. "I love you too, Hannah. From the moment I saw you on that platform, trying so hard to be brave, you've owned my heart ever since." They made love again, slower this time, learning what brought pleasure, what made the other gasp and sigh. And when they finally fell asleep tangled together, Hannah knew she'd made the right choice. This wild, beautiful life with this strong, gentle man was exactly where she belonged. Autumn came to the mountains in a blaze of gold and crimson. Hannah and Fletcher worked together to prepare for winter, cutting wood and stacking it against the cabin walls, hunting elk and deer for the smokehouse, gathering the last of the garden's bounty. They moved in easy harmony now, each anticipating the other's needs, working as the true partners Fletcher had hoped they'd become. On a crisp October morning, Hannah woke feeling queasy. She barely made it outside before losing her breakfast. Fletcher was beside her instantly, holding her hair back, his hand gentle on her back. When the sickness passed, she sat back on her heels, wiping her mouth with shaking hands. Fletcher brought her water from the creek, his expression concerned. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "3 mornings now." Hannah took a sip of water, her mind racing through the signs she'd been ignoring. The tender breasts, the exhaustion, the way certain smells had started bothering her. "Fletcher, I think I might be pregnant." His eyes went wide. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise over the mountains. "Really? You think so?" "I'm pretty sure." She found herself smiling back despite the lingering nausea. "How do you feel about being a father?" In answer, Fletcher swept her up into his arms, spinning her around before setting her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "I feel like the luckiest man alive. A wife I love, a baby on the way. This life is more than I ever dreamed of." He kissed her tenderly, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this gift." Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November. Hannah watched it through the cabin windows, marveling at how the world transformed into something pristine and beautiful. Fletcher had been right that winter was harsh. The temperature plummeted, and the snow piled up past the windows. But inside the cabin, with a roaring fire and plenty of supplies, they were comfortable. Hannah's pregnancy progressed well despite the occasional morning sickness. Fletcher was attentive to the point of being comical, insisting she rest constantly, doing most of the heavy work himself. She humored him because his concern came from love, but she also insisted on doing her share. She wasn't fragile, and the work kept her strong. They spent long winter evenings reading by firelight, Fletcher's voice deep and soothing as he read aloud from the books on his shelves. They talked about the baby, discussing names and making plans. They made love frequently, Fletcher infinitely careful with her changing body, worshiping her with hands and lips until she was breathless and satisfied. In February, during a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow, Fletcher made his way down to Lordsburg for supplies. He returned 3 days later with a wagon full of goods, including fabric for baby clothes, which he presented to Hannah with shy pride. "I didn't know what to get," he admitted. "So I bought several different kinds. The shopkeeper's wife helped." Hannah sorted through the soft cotton and flannel, her eyes misting with tears. Pregnancy had made her emotional, prone to crying at the smallest kindnesses. "It's perfect, all of it." She spent the rest of the winter sewing tiny clothes, making blankets and diapers, preparing for their child. Fletcher built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, carving a pattern of mountains and trees into the headboard. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting to reveal new growth. Hannah's belly had grown round and prominent, the baby active inside her. She could feel tiny feet and hands pressing against her skin, and Fletcher spent hours with his hand on her stomach, marveling at every movement. "Strong baby," he'd say with satisfaction. "Going to be a fighter." In late May, as wildflowers began blooming in the meadow, Hannah's labor began. Fletcher had brought a midwife from Lordsburg a week earlier, a competent woman named Mrs. Patterson who delivered hundreds of babies. She took charge immediately, sending Fletcher to boil water and gather clean linens, keeping him busy while she examined Hannah. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Fletcher stayed with Hannah the entire time despite Mrs. Patterson's suggestions that he wait elsewhere. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, whispered encouragement when she was too exhausted to continue. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their baby was born. A son, lusty and loud, with a shock of dark hair in his father's gray eyes. "You have a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, placing the squalling infant on Hannah's chest. "And he's perfect." Hannah looked down at her son through tears of joy and exhaustion, unable to believe he was real was theirs. Fletcher knelt beside the bed, his own eyes wet, his large hand gently cradling the baby's tiny head. "He's beautiful," Fletcher said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's so beautiful, Hannah." "What should we name him?" Hannah asked, stroking their son's soft cheek. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "My father's name was Frank. Would you mind if we called him that, Frank Jensen Marlowe?" "Frank," Hannah repeated, testing it. "I love it. Hello, Frank. Welcome to the world, little one." Frank's first year passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. He was a good baby, strong and healthy, meeting every milestone right on time. Fletcher proved to be a devoted father, patient with the crying, eager to help with every aspect of care. Hannah would often find him in the rocking chair by the fire, Frank cradled against his broad chest, both of them asleep. Hannah's love for Fletcher deepened as she watched him with their son. The tenderness this powerful man showed to such a tiny, helpless creature never failed to move her. And Fletcher's love for her seemed to grow as well, his eyes following her around the cabin with such warmth that it made her blush. When Frank was 6 months old, Hannah realized she was pregnant again. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't wanted to say anything until she was certain. This time, when she told Fletcher, his reaction was even more joyful. "Another one," he breathed, pulling her into his arms. "We're going to have another baby." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, though his expression left no doubt. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. He kissed her deeply, then dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach. "I never imagined my life could be this full, this good." Their daughter was born the following spring, an easier labor than Frank's had been. She arrived quickly, almost catching Mrs. Patterson by surprise, a tiny red-faced bundle with Hannah's dark hair and a surprisingly loud cry for such a small baby. "A girl," Fletcher said with wonder, holding his daughter for the first time. She looked impossibly tiny in his huge hands, delicate and perfect. "We have a daughter." "Her name is Hazel," Hannah said. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, had known somehow that this baby was a girl, would need a name that was both strong and feminine. "Hazel Rose Marlowe." Fletcher looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. "It's perfect. She's perfect." "You're perfect." "I'm exhausted and sweaty and probably smell terrible," Hannah corrected with a tired laugh. "You're perfect," he repeated firmly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. The years that followed were full and rich, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Fletcher expanded the cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms to accommodate their growing family. Hannah's garden grew larger, producing enough vegetables to trade in Lordsburg for other supplies. Fletcher's fur trading business prospered, giving them a comfortable income. Frank grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. He loved following Fletcher around, learning to hunt and trap and work with his hands. Hazel was bright and energetic, her laughter filling the cabin as she toddled after her brother and begged to help with everything. When Frank was 4 and Hazel 2, Hannah gave birth to twin boys, much to everyone's surprise. The pregnancy had been harder than her others, and she'd grown enormous, but no one had suspected twins until they started arriving. Samuel and Simon Marlowe, identical in appearance but different in temperament from the start. Samuel was calm and observant, content to sit and play quietly. Simon was restless and curious, always getting into mischief. Fletcher handled the chaos of 4 young children with good-humored patience, though Hannah sometimes caught him looking overwhelmed when all 4 were crying or demanding attention at once. But he never complained, never suggested their family was too large or too much work. He adored his children and showed it constantly, playing with them, teaching them, telling them stories by the fire. Hannah watched him with their children and felt her heart swell with love. This man who'd paid double her price at an auction and set her free to choose him had given her everything. A home, a family, a life filled with purpose and love. She'd never imagined such happiness was possible. 5 years after the twins were born, when Hannah was 32 and Fletcher 40, they took a family trip to Lordsburg. It had been years since Hannah had been to town, and she was nervous about how it would feel to return to the place where her life had changed so dramatically. The town had grown in the past decade, new buildings and new people everywhere. But Hannah still recognized the town square where the auction had taken place. She stared at the spot where the platform had stood, remembering the fear and humiliation she'd felt that day. Fletcher came up beside her, taking her hand. The children were with Mrs. Patterson, who'd stayed in Lordsburg and still occasionally helped with difficult births. "You all right?" Fletcher asked quietly. "I was just thinking about that day," Hannah said. "How terrified I was. How certain my life was ending. And now," she turned to look at him, this man she loved more than life itself. His hair was beginning to silver at the temples, lines had deepened around his eyes, but he was still as strong and handsome as the day he'd climbed onto that platform. "Now I know it was just beginning," she said. "Everything good in my life started that day. You, the children, our home, all of it came from what seemed like the worst moment of my life." Fletcher raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles just as he had on the porch of his cabin all those years ago. "Best $6,000 I ever spent," Hannah laughed. "I thought you didn't buy me." "I didn't. I bought us a chance. You're the one who chose to take it." They stood together in the square, hands clasped, thinking about the unlikely path that had brought them together. A gambler's daughter and a mountain man, brought together by desperation and compassion, who'd built a love that would last a lifetime. Later that day they ran into Vincent Calhoun on the street. He was older now, grayer, walking with a cane. He looked at Hannah and Fletcher with recognition but no malice. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said, tipping his hat. "Marlowe, I heard you 2 made a go of it up in the mountains. Got a whole passel of kids now, I understand." "4," Fletcher said, his voice neutral but his body tense beside Hannah. Calhoun nodded slowly. "I won't apologize for what I did back then. Business is business, but I will say I'm glad it worked out for the girl." Most of them don't get happy endings. He looked at Hannah directly. Your father used that money I gave him to start over in Santa Fe. Last I heard, he was doing well. Hasn't touched a card or dice in years. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for telling me. I hadn't heard from him. He was too ashamed to reach out, I expect, but he asked about you through mutual acquaintances. Wanted to know you were all right. Calhoun started to walk away, then paused. Take care of her, Marlowe. She's good people. Always have, always will, Fletcher said firmly. They watched Calhoun disappear into the crowd. Hannah leaned against Fletcher's solid strength, processing this unexpected news about her father. You want to try to contact him? Fletcher asked. We could send a letter to Santa Fe. Hannah thought about it. Part of her wanted to see her father, to show him the life she'd built, to let him know she didn't blame him. But another part of her recognized that some doors, once closed, needed to stay that way. Maybe someday, she said. But not yet. I'm not ready. Whenever you are, we'll make it happen, Fletcher promised. They collected the children from Mrs. Patterson and began the journey home. The kids were excited, chattering about everything they'd seen in town. Frank, now 9, helped his father manage the supply wagon. Hazel, 7, entertained the 5-year-old twins with stories and games. As they climbed into the mountains, Hannah felt the familiar peace settling over her. This was where she belonged, in this wild, beautiful country with this good, strong man and their children. The cabin came into view as the sun was setting, its windows glowing with the welcoming light of home. The years continued to pass, each one adding depth and richness to their lives. The children grew, learning to love the mountains as their parents did. Frank became an expert hunter and tracker by the time he was 15. Hazel proved to have a gift for healing, learning about medicinal plants and helping Mrs. Patterson with difficult births when she was old enough. The twins developed their own skills, Samuel becoming a skilled craftsman like his father, Simon showing a talent for working with horses. Fletcher and Hannah grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had disagreements occasionally, as any couple does, but they'd learned to talk through problems, to respect each other's perspectives. The foundation of choice and freedom that their marriage was built on kept it strong. When Hannah was 40 and Fletcher 48, they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. The children, now ranging from 15 to 11, had planned a surprise celebration. They decorated the cabin with wildflowers and had prepared a feast with everyone contributing something. After dinner, as the sun set in glorious colors over the mountains, Fletcher took Hannah's hand and led her outside. They walked to their favorite spot, a rise overlooking the valley, where they could see for miles in every direction. 20 years, Fletcher said, pulling her close. Seems like yesterday and like forever ago all at once. I know what you mean. Hannah leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. That I get to wake up every morning with you in this beautiful place, surrounded by our children. Any regrets? Not a single one. She turned in his arms to face him. You gave me everything, Fletcher. Freedom, choice, love, family. I was standing on that auction block thinking my life was over, and you showed me it was just beginning. Fletcher's expression was tender as he cupped her face in his hands. You gave me just as much. A reason to build instead of just survive. Someone to share the beauty of this place with. Children to teach and watch grow. You made my life mean something, Hannah. He kissed her as the last light faded from the sky, and Hannah felt the same flutter in her stomach that she'd felt the first time he'd kissed her all those years ago. Some things never changed. This man, this love, this life they'd built together, it was everything she'd never known to hope for. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, to where their children waited with laughter and warmth and the promise of years yet to come. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, guardians of the love story that had unfolded in their shadow. The years rolled on like the seasons, each bringing its own joys and sorrows. Hannah's hair turned gray, and Fletcher's beard went white as snow. Their bodies grew slower, but their love remained as strong as ever. They watched their children grow into fine adults, each finding their own path. Frank married a girl from Lordsburg and started his own ranch in the valley below. Hazel became a renowned healer, traveling throughout the territory to help those in need, but always returning home to the mountains. Samuel built beautiful furniture that people came from miles around to buy. Simon started a horse breeding operation that became known throughout New Mexico. Fletcher and Hannah became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The cabin that had once seemed so isolated was now the heart of a growing family, with children and grandchildren visiting regularly, filling it with life and laughter. On a crisp autumn morning when Hannah was 62 and Fletcher 70, they sat together on the porch they'd sat on so many times before. The mountains blazed with fall color, the air was sweet and cool, and a comfortable silence stretched between them. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Hannah asked. "About giving me a week to decide." Fletcher smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling deeply. "I remember. I was so nervous you'd choose to leave. I was nervous too. I didn't trust myself to make the right choice." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "But it was the easiest decision I ever made, then and every day since. No regrets. You could have had an easier life in a town with neighbors and shops and society. I had the life I was meant for, with the man I was meant to love." Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's all I ever needed." They sat in peaceful silence, watching the sun move across the sky, marking the passage of another perfect day in a lifetime of perfect days. The mountains stood guard around them, as they had for 29 years, as they would for whatever time remained. When Fletcher passed away in his sleep, 5 years later at the age of 75, Hannah held his hand and whispered words of love until his breathing stilled. She grieved deeply, but without regret. They'd had 34 years together, had built a life and family that would continue long after they were gone. She'd loved him with everything she had, and had been loved just as completely in return. Hannah lived another 8 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, still sharp and engaged with the world. She told stories of the Wild West days, of mountain living, and most of all of the man who'd paid double her price at an auction and set her free to choose him. When her time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her weathered face. Her family buried her next to Fletcher on the rise overlooking the valley, where they'd spent so many evenings watching the sunset together. On her headstone, her children carved the words she'd requested. She chose love, and love chose her back. The cabin still stands today, maintained by the Marlowe descendants who recognize it as the foundation of their family. Visitors come sometimes, drawn by the story of the auction bride and the mountain man, of the unlikely love that grew in the wilderness. But those who knew them best understand that there was nothing unlikely about it at all. Two souls found each other in desperate circumstances, recognized something true and good in each other, and built a life on the foundation of choice, respect, and love. It was a simple story in many ways, but it was also everything that mattered. The mountains keep their secrets, but they remember. They remember the day a man climbed onto an auction platform and offered freedom to a woman who'd never known it. They remember the years of laughter and work and growing love. They remember the family that flourished in that high valley, generation after generation. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets in gold and crimson over the peaks, some say you can still feel it, the love that transformed two strangers into soulmates, that turned a transaction into a covenant, that proved the best things in life are those we choose freely and hold onto fiercely. Hannah Jensen had stood on an auction block expecting to lose everything. Instead, she'd gained the world. And Fletcher Marlowe, who'd lived alone in the mountains for 5 years, had found the missing piece of his soul in the most unexpected place. Their love story became legend in the territory, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. They'd simply loved each other, day after day, year after year, through hardship and joy, through youth and age, through all the ordinary moments that add up to an extraordinary life. The Wild West was a hard land, unforgiving and brutal in many ways. But it was also a place where second chances were possible, where people could reinvent themselves, where love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. Hannah and Fletcher's story was proof of that, a testament to the power of choice, the strength of commitment, and the enduring truth that love, real love, is always worth choosing. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in New Mexico, some in the mountains, some in towns, carrying forward the legacy of strength and love that began with a mountain man's generosity and a young woman's courage. The family gatherings are loud and joyful, filled with dozens of people who owe their existence to that day in Lordsburg, when Fletcher Marlowe paid double and set Hannah Jensen free. And somewhere in the high country, where the peaks touch the sky and the air is thin and clean, where wildflowers bloom in the summer and snow falls deep in winter, the spirit of that love lives on. In the wind through the pines, in the cry of the eagle, in the endless cycle of the seasons. Two people met in darkness and chose to walk into the light together. They built something beautiful that lasted beyond their years, beyond their own lives, creating ripples that spread outward through generations. They proved that the best love stories aren't about grand gestures or fairy tale romance, but about daily choices, consistent kindness, and the determination to build something lasting together. Hannah had been sold to pay her father's debts. Fletcher had paid double and set her free. But in the end, they'd both been freed from loneliness, from fear, from lives half-lived. They'd chosen each other, and that choice had made all the difference. The mountains stand eternal, keeping watch over the valley where their story unfolded. And in the hearts of those who hear it, the tale of the auction bride and the mountain man lives on. A reminder that love can find us in our darkest moments, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that the best things in life are those we choose with our whole hearts. That's the legacy of Hannah and Fletcher Marlowe, not just a family, not just a story, but a living proof that love, real love, transforms everything it touches. From an auction block to a mountain cabin, from strangers to soulmates, from despair to joy, their journey was complete. And it all began with a simple choice, freely given and freely received, to take a chance on love.